All right, welcome into the latest edition of the second half draft show. I'm your host, Juice, flying solo this evening and having a bit of technical difficulties here, bit of a lag here. Hopefully, the audio is coming through pretty clean. I'm going to minimize myself here shortly, but hopefully, the audio is coming in clean, not too choppy, so we can talk a little bit about the Week 10 slate. The Week 10 slate. That's where we're at. The 2025 NCAA season moving right along, and we're at the point where we start talking about teams kind of separating themselves. Who are the pretenders? Who are the contenders? We'll start to figure that out because, of course, there's a lot of conference play taking place, and then you have matchups in which you have a clear favorite, but anybody can be beat any week. And I think obviously the contenders. Yes, they may drop a game here or there, but generally speaking, they take care of business. Typically, they take care of business. So that's really what I'm going to be looking for. And as we go through the Week 10 slate, try to identify, what games we think will ultimately illuminate who's a contender versus who's a pretender. I think there are a few that we already kind of understand. We expect them to be there throughout the course of this thing, even if they don't necessarily win their conference titles, that they're going to be playing in the college football playoff and have an opportunity to compete for a national championship. Whereas there's other teams that you're kind of on the fence about. You're not certain of, right? And then those that we kind of expect. Maybe they got off to a good start, but they've already started to kind of show signs that they're not a contender. Dropped a couple of games to lesser competition or whatever the case may be. So let's jump into this Week 10 slate as I share screen here. And as promised, minimize myself. All right. So obviously, it's Halloween. Happy Halloween, by the way. We're getting into the month of November, which means Maction, which means we're going to have college football on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I mean, literally every day of the week except for maybe Monday, even perhaps on Monday. So it's already underway, but it's really going to come through. You'll start to see it on network television here coming in November. But I want to jump to the Saturday slate. And I think some of the most intriguing games actually are in that initial window, that 12 o'clock window, right? Of course, under different circumstances, Penn State, Ohio State would probably be the game of the week. Of course, Drew Aller suffered a season-ending injury, perhaps a career-ending injury at Penn State. We're not expecting to see him back again this year. This was supposed to be his swan song and the campaign that would kind of buoy him into the conversation of top quarterbacks in the 2026 NFL draft. That clearly has not transpired. They're going to face Ohio State on the road. As you can see, the line is 18 and a half. Ohio State is playing tremendous defense. Their young quarterback is starting to play with more and more confidence. Ohio State's going to be tough to beat. I don't think this team, top to bottom, is as good as it was, as talented, as deep as it was a season ago. I think they have some inexperience here and there. And again, I just don't know that they have the same level of depth that they had a season ago, but they're a battle-tested team as it relates to understanding how to win and not beating themselves. That said, they don't play great competition this year. I think perhaps the key matchups, obviously the opener against Texas. Texas is not the team that we had anticipated coming into this season. They took care of business against Washington. Washington, a bit of an up and down, talented team, but a bit up and down. I don't know that Ohio State's going to play a really quality opponent until they face Michigan, and that is more rivalry than Michigan dotting the I's and crossing the T's in terms of all the facets of the game, all the phases of the game. So it's interesting because I haven't necessarily seen Julian Sand, again, that freshman quarterback, really tested to this point, right? I think there's reasons to be encouraged about how he's playing, and certainly he's garnering experience and getting better. The confidence this team is playing with, certainly you see that on Saturdays. The way the defense is playing is really tremendous, and their ability to just keep the opposition out of the end zone, right? The number of goal to goal situations where they don't end up giving up any points really is really staggering. And I think, a team that actually happens to figure out, maybe they don't, but whomever seems to figure out how to actually punch in on those, goal to go situations against Ohio State probably will give them a run for their money. But it just has not, materialized to this point. And a lot of credit goes to Ohio State and Matt Patricia, right? He's done a great job. You have to tip your hat to him and what this defense has done despite losing a lot of starters to the 2025 NFL draft. So, as I mentioned, this game likely would have been, the game of the week. But Penn State doesn't have their starting quarterback, and they no longer have their coach in James Franklin, right? And it'll be interesting to see. I think James Franklin will have a pretty good bevy of options, right? When it's all said and done in terms of where he lands next, whether he jumps right back into coaching in the 2026 season or takes a year off, goes into the media, whatever the case may be. I think he will certainly have a number of suitors, quality suitors, but unfortunately for Penn State, whom had Big Ten championship aspirations, and of course they were a college football playoff team a season ago. It's not materializing that. A couple of bad losses to UCLA and Northwestern. Again, as I mentioned, their head coach, their starting quarterback, they're perhaps Heisman hopeful, top 5 NFL draft pick, thought process coming into the season. It just all went bad. It just all went bad. So I'm not expecting a great game here, unfortunately. Penn State still has, individual players on either side of the ball that I think are going to be NFL contributors for sure. But this is just not a team that's playing at a high enough level. And certainly without the trigger man and the head coach in place, I just don't see a scenario where they upset Ohio State. Now, from Ohio State's perspective, you would expect them to continue to do what they're doing, right? Play great defense, give their young quarterback opportunities to continue to garner confidence. I think that's really what it's about. I think he's doing a good job of managing games in certain instances, making plays. But the thought process here is to protect the football, stay on schedule, stay ahead of the chains, get the ball to Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Lake, who is really helping himself as far as the NFL draft stock is concerned. And then play great defense behind that, right? Play great defense. Arvell Reese really has shot up the draft board, right? Again, we're talking about their entire defensive line a season ago going into the NFL, right? They're starting down 4. I had a first round pick, a couple of, early day 2 picks among that group. And now we're talking about, the second level of the defense, Arvell Reese, who plays off-ball linebacker, will rush the quarterback as well, does a bit of a both, kind of a tweener type. He might be better than all of those guys when it's all said and done in terms of the edge rushers, right? And the guys that can also play off the ball, play in space. He might be a better prospect than all those guys when it's all said and done. Of course, you have Caleb Downs, who, arguably the best draft prospect for the 2026 class. So as I said, this would have been a really intriguing matchup a few weeks ago. But considering what has taken place with the Nittany Lions, Happy Valley, it just seems like one of those situations where this one can get out of hand. And as you can see with this line, minus 18.5, that's exactly what Vegas is expecting. So we move on to perhaps now the game of the week with Vandy and Texas. Another, among those 12 o'clock window games, this one intrigues me quite a bit because Vanderbilt clearly, a top 10 pick, top 10 team, top 9 team here, making noise in the SEC. Texas, an incredibly talented team. Like there's no debate there. I don't think anybody questions that. They just have not been able to put it together, and a lot of that falls on the quarterback. Arch Manning has not played up to expectations. There was an outside chance. I never really put a lot of stock into Arch actually going pro. But there was an outside chance that if he had success, and Texas had the type of season that folks were anticipating for the Longhorns, that he could be in the conversation among the top quarterbacks selected in the 2026 NFL draft. So, but it's actually Vandy's starting quarterback that is now getting more and more attention as far as being a draft prospect and potentially high draft pick as NFL teams start to try to figure out, okay, who are we going to turn to? Right. And I'm going to use a part of this live stream to talk about those teams that are in the quarterback market or should be in the quarterback market. And then, considering the bevy of prospects we thought may have been available or would fit the bill, things have really changed. That's why they play the games, right? That's why you have to go out there and perform. The landscape has changed. So I want to talk about that and talk about fits and so on and so forth. But intriguing game. Texas is favored against Vandy, but it would not surprise me, especially when you consider this -3.5 line, if Vandy goes in and pulls out the win. They're playing really good football. They can effectively beat anybody in my mind. The next game, obviously near and dear to my heart. I got my Canes are visiting SMU, and SMU has a fairly significant contingency of former Canes on this team and in the coaching staff. Brett Lashley is a former offensive coordinator for the Hurricanes, and SMU has certainly revitalized their football program. I think Brett Lashley is slated to get a significant extension. There's a lot of money. I'm just going to call it what it is. There's a lot of money that flows through Dallas, right? And in terms of boosters and in terms of resources, SMU certainly has what it takes in order to compete. I don't know that their roster is necessarily where it needs to be to make some significant noise in the ACC. They certainly did so a season ago, made it to the ACC championship. Unfortunately, they lost to Clemson, if memory serves me correctly. They're dealing with some injuries. Of course, they've lost talent to the NFL. So they're one of those teams that if you don't buckle your chin strap, you can get embarrassed because they tend to field an explosive offense. But I don't know that they're at full strength. And if Miami comes out and doesn't necessarily play to the level of competition, I expect the Canes to come out of this road game with a win. I think the big thing from Miami's perspective is, staying ahead of the chains and keeping the running game viable. I've yet to feel like Carson Beck has played at a high enough level where, if the running game isn't necessarily, firing on all cylinders and the defense, let's say SMU, with their tempo and speed, poses a challenge to this defense. Can Carson Beck go score for score? Right. And I've yet to really see that to this point. And one of the things that I expect of a seasoned quarterback like Carson Beck, again, the door is kind of open, right? I know Fernando Mendoza has kind of, staked this claim to QB1, as well as Ty Simpson certainly making his case as well. But I still think because of the sheer number of teams that are looking to improve their quarterback room, whether it be the starter or perhaps a backup or a player that they can develop into a starter, Carson Beck is really missing out on this opportunity to help himself, right? It's just one of those things where it's like it's seemingly all there in front of you, right? You have a quality offensive line. You do have a good running game. I will say that I'm a little disappointed with offensive coordinator Shannon Dawson in terms of him getting his weapons, the bevy of weapons Miami has, all of them involved, right? The offense goes to Malachi Tony, our true freshman, who's terrific. And I agree, he should be the focal point of the offense in the passing game. But there just seems to be a bit of a contraction with the playbook when we're in week 10 and the playbook should be opening. We should be going deeper in the playbook. So I don't know if that's a lack of confidence in Carson Beck. I don't know if that's just a shortcoming of Dawson, a combination thereof. But certainly Miami, there's another level, I think, particularly with the offense. I think there's another level to get to with this Hurricanes team. I just don't know that Carson Beck has done enough to get us there at that point. So hopefully they put it together here on the road against SMU. What's going on, Mr. C? Shout out. Yeah, I agree with you. Miami, the Saints, and the Raiders are the first few teams that come to mind. You can't rule out the Jets, obviously, right? They have their quarterback concerns. He had an opportunity, Mr. C. He really had an opportunity to change that narrative, right? Last year, he was looking real day three-ish, as you mentioned, right? We were we were doing the Patreon thing. We were breaking down the film, and it just was like, yeah, you clearly have some arm talent, but there's just no consistency in terms of his play as it relates to accuracy, decision making, understanding what defenses are trying to do to him. So yeah, as you mentioned, day three-ish, which means developmental prospect, right? You got some tools, but we're not ready to hand the keys to you, right? And our expectations aren't that high at the end of the day. And I thought, especially the way the season started, that maybe he could rehabilitate it because going into last season, Beck on most boards was the top quarterback going into the season, right? And of course his play didn't hold up. His supporting cast certainly didn't play well enough. That's not a good argument in this instance, right? It's just not a good argument in this instance. I wondered earlier in the season whether or not the recovery from the injury, the fact that he didn't have a full spring. But at this point, we're in week 10. At this point, you're an experienced quarterback. You've been fairly well protected in terms of the offensive line. Like I expected a lot more from Beck, and I just haven't seen it thus far. So hopefully he can really finish this campaign strong. All right. Just sifting through here, and another intriguing matchup here in the ACC is between Duke and Clemson. So Darian Mensah is another prospect at the quarterback position that I think you just gotta get acquainted with, right? He put up some impressive numbers at Tulane, and the offense obviously goes through him at Duke. Duke is kind of up and down. They're kind of up and down in turn, but they're the type of team that could effectively beat anybody. And I think this obviously is, as the line suggests, -3.5 favoring Clemson. With Clemson being at home, this could go either way, right? We talked about the quarterback position, and Cade Klubnik was another one of those prospects, not unlike Drew Aller, that for different reasons has not helped himself, right? And we've talked about it ad nauseum over the years about Clemson's offense and the inherent challenges associated with it, that they don't use the entire field, and their low percentage throws seem to be the focal point, the emphasis in this offense, and personnel groupings and play design just doesn't necessarily add up. So all of that on top of the fact that Klubnik throughout his career, and Klubnik has started a lot of football games, has been wildly inconsistent, right? And again, you can attribute some of that to the lack of development, and the corresponding system that he's in Clemson, and then of course himself, right? Clemson is a team that again is a very talented group, but they have a tendency to play down to the competition, and I don't know that they're a very well coached team. Since even on the defensive side of the ball, that used to be the one thing that you could kind of hang your hat on as it relates to Clemson, is how they play defense and their defensive line. And since Brent Venables has been gone, that defense hasn't been the same. It hasn't been the same. So then you compound the issues on the offensive side of the ball because you don't play that upper echelon defense anymore at Clemson. So interesting game, because I think there's a lot of draft prospects in this game. The Duke has a handful, and Clemson certainly has several. Just depends on what type of team you're going to get from week to week with both of these squads. You just never know. Duke can go out there, and like I said, they could hang 30, 35 on quality opponents, and then the very next week they can't get out of first gear. So I'm interested to see Mensah, even more so than Klubnik, in this one, because I think, again, Clemson has the horses, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, right? Darian Mensah continues to string together good performances. He can certainly help himself. I know he signed a 2-year NIL deal with Duke, and quiet as it's kept, it's $4 million a year. So they think very highly of him, and I think a lot of college football teams think very highly of Darian Mensah. And when you see him play, you get the sense why. But again, consistency seems to be what's missing with many of these quarterbacks. So really intriguing matchup there as well. The rest of the 12 o'clock games, obviously you got some group of 5 matchups here. Those teams always have NFL draft prospects, and I plan to unearth those guys over the course of the next several months. But I won't be tuning into those games. All right. I may poke my head in on this Arizona State, Iowa State game. right? You got Sam Levitt, you got Jordan Tyson leading the charge there with Arizona State. Iowa State is obviously a well-coached team. The big citrus, Dominique Orange, whom I haven't necessarily watched much of Iowa State as of late. Hopefully he's healthy. He's a difference maker, and he certainly will be playing on Sundays. You're looking for a two-down run stopper with some pass rush chops. Dominic Orange certainly possesses that. I think he's effectively a three-down player, although his body might suggest more of a two-down player. This is an intriguing matchup in my mind as well, and one that I certainly will poke my head in because, like I said, Sam Levitt is kind of in that area where up and down, peaks and valleys, lack of consistency. But aside from the Mendozas of the world, the Ty Simpsons, perhaps even Dante Moore, there seems to be a lot of opportunity for signal callers to really help themselves over the course of the remaining part of the season, going into the playoffs, and then certainly through the pre-draft process. So I don't want to summarily dismiss Sam Levitt, although I do have some concerns about his play. All right, we keep it going here. I've mentioned Fernando Mendoza a couple of times, and he will be playing on CBS, heavily favored on the road against Maryland, and for good reason. This Indiana team is legit. I don't think. Excuse me, I don't think there's any doubt that this Indiana team is for real. Mendoza certainly has stabilized things, and not just stabilizing. He's playing at a high level, Heisman level, right? When they play lesser competition, they take care of business like you're supposed to, and that to me is a mark of a quality football team, right? And then of course when they've played better competition, they found ways to win. Indiana is remarkably physical. Signetti has signed a long-term deal, so he's going to be around for a while. I know, like the Penn States of the world, I'm sure, are going to be sniffing around LSU, but I think he's comfortable where he's at, especially since he's inked that new deal. And Indiana, to me, I fully expect them to be in the Big Ten championship, in all likelihood playing against Ohio State. And I think they have the requisite talent to come out on top in that particular matchup, right? So we'll get a chance to see Mendoza and this Hoosier team against Maryland. I've been working on a film study breakdown of Mendoza for off and on for weeks. It is well past due, well past due. But I've been working on it for weeks, and when I first started evaluating Mendoza, and I got to give credit where credit is due, because there's been a number of folks that even coming into the season were really on the Mendoza hype train, and I couldn't really understand it. I didn't see it back at Cal, right? He's a former Cal transfer. I just didn't see it, right? And I wonder if it was just the games that I watched. Clearly, I watched him against Miami, made some plays, but I thought Miami's defense was just poor, right? I didn't see anything that wowed me by any stretch of the imagination. I watched him. I went back and watched him against FSU, a historically bad FSU team, right? I know they traveled, West Coast to East Coast, and that certainly could play or hamper, your effectiveness, right, with that long plane ride. But even in that game against a bad team, I didn't see anything that I could hang my hat on, see anything that really wowed me or really intrigued me. And then, of course, the early parts of this season, playing, lesser competition, but very efficient, putting up video game numbers, very efficient. I watched him against Illinois, and I think this is one of the game where I think the masses started to pay attention. I watched him against Illinois, and Illinois, again, one of those teams that, kind of like a Duke, right? Has talent, doesn't always show up. And Indiana took them behind the woodshed. It was all Indiana in that game, and I think perhaps Mendoza threw 2 incompletions in that game, 4 or 5 TDs. It was remarkably efficient, accurate. There were a couple of really nice professional throws. Whether it be an opposite hash read, what he did in the red zone kind of stood out to me, right? But there were very few NFL caliber throws, right? It was a cornucopia of zone read and RPOs. You know what I'm saying? Like so much RPO that I'm like, you cannot operate an offense like this at the NFL level, right? I still don't know what to make of Fernando Mendoza. But as I continue to watch him, and I saw him against Oregon, I saw him against Iowa, games where he didn't necessarily have the same level of efficiency that Iowa and Oregon challenged him, right? That they were able to get him off his spot in certain instances. In fact, I thought Iowa gave him more of a fight than Oregon did, frankly. But wasn't his best games, and there were just elements, and I think that's part of the reason why I really started to appreciate his game. There were elements and plays within those games where things weren't necessarily going according to plan. It wasn't all easy. Everything wasn't on schedule, and you started to see more of those NFL caliber throws and situational football and things where you can kind of hang your hat on and really get an appreciation for what type of quarterback he is when things aren't perfect, because when things are clean, Mendoza is phenomenal. He's been phenomenal. He rarely misses. There've been a couple of deep throws that I think that have backed up on him, but I think he's even corrected that. In subsequent weeks, he's corrected that, right? So I'm seeing this overwhelming amount of RPO and is trying to figure out how is this going to translate to the next level. And the parts of it that translate is the accuracy. It's the ball placement, right? It's incredibly consistent. You're protecting your receivers. You're putting the ball in a spot where only your receiver can get to it, or your receiver can make a play after the catch, right? Short to intermediate, he is as good as any quarterback in this class. Short to intermediate, and then of course there are some big time hole shot type throws because the arm is certainly there. That's what confused me in terms of why he was underthrowing some of those deep throws. Perhaps not necessarily having the best of mechanics, weight transfer at times, but there's a lot to like about Fernando Mendoza. There really is. And again, as the more I watched him, the greater appreciation I got for him. And it was those games where he wasn't necessarily 21 for 23, 300 yards, 4 TDs. It was a bit uglier. He had a turnover or two, right? He was getting pressured. It was those games that I started to actually develop more of an appreciation for what he can do. So I certainly won't argue with anyone who has him as a leader of the clubhouse among the quarterbacks. And again, I expect him to put up big numbers against Maryland. Georgia at UF, the cocktail party, the biggest cocktail party, or is that how it's used to be described anyway? The Gators obviously have decided to make a move. Billy Napier is no longer there. I think Drew welcomes it. I called it. As a Canes fan, right? State of Florida. I hope to pilfer that roster. I really do. There's quite a bit of talent there. They've dealt with injuries. Caleb Banks to me is big time. Is big time. I think he's a talented enough player to go in the first round, but I think given his injuries, he'll probably slip into day two, come at a bit of a discount. It'll be interesting to see if Florida has the fight, because Georgia quietly, Gunnar Stockton quietly, is fifth in the country. They're right there in the thick of things, and they're being tested on a weekly basis in the SEC. There's no question about it, right? The SEC, the teams, they're going to beat up each other. They're going to beat up each other. Georgia has the pedigree under Kirby Smart. So as Gunnar Stockton continues to play, continues to make plays, garners more confidence, Georgia's going to be, a factor when it's all said and done. He's going to be in the thick of things, or that team is going to be in the thick of things. So again, I'm curious. I'm intrigued to see how UF goes about, running their offense. Dallas Wilson, young freshman receiver, really excited about him. It came down to Florida, Oregon. Now with Billy Napier gone, perhaps he then decides to go to Oregon. He decides to get on that transfer into the transfer portal. It'll be interesting to see if there's an exodus, a mass exodus of talent from UF, and how they respond in season, right? Do they fold up their tent? Do they play spoiler, or are they just kind of waiting for their opportunity to say, you know what, I'm going to go and evaluate my options, the players that is, right? Because there are some talented football players on this UF roster. But yes, in terms of Georgia, I am impressed by Gunnar Stockton. I'm impressed by just the leadership and the playmaking ability that I'm seeing. He's growing on a weekly basis. Georgia has quality defenders. I love C.J. Allen, second level of that defense. Our offensive line is pretty experienced. Played. What was a bit disappointing last year. They were a disappointment last year, but playing a little bit better this year. The receiving room, right, in terms of the pass catchers, obviously performing a little bit better this year. They dropped a lot of passes last year. That contributed to some of Beck's issues. That can't account for all of them, but certainly contributed to it. So we'll see. We'll see how Georgia, plays, but I expect them to take care of business here against UF, despite it being a rivalry game. All right. I see Notre Dame at Boston College. I just love those pair of backs, man. Jeremiah Love and Price. That 1-2 punch is really impressive. Texas Tech, go ahead and get a look at Romello Height and David Bailey. Couch Potato General Manager, second half draft show. We maintain, in terms of this pure pass rush, and David Bailey is probably the best prospect in the class. He's the top 10 pick as far as we're concerned. I wouldn't call him the best defensive player or among those. I think that is a Ruben Bain, Caleb Downs conversation. But certainly in terms of just being able to affect the passer, few do so as effectively or as consistently as David Bailey. So, and then again, Romello Height, he too can get after the quarterback. He's bounced around, been to a number of different schools, but he has a very intriguing skill set and then frame that the arm length, the wingspan. Certainly, I imagine NFL teams will covet that. So, Texas Tech, they had a bit of a bad loss, not unlike Miami a couple of weeks ago, but they're still right there. They're still in striking distance. Okay, keep it going here in terms of the Week 10 slate. Not a ton of great 3:30 games. Again, you look at these individual rosters, there's always a player or two. No, Mississippi. No, Mississippi. It's been the time has been lacking. The time has been lacking. But I do think we got to get a November update in, and we got to get one in soon. So hopefully I can get that knocked out here in the coming week. I'll be sure to let you know. I'll let you know on the Patreon. Keep it going here. Let's look at the 7 p.m. window. South Carolina, Ole Miss. Ole Miss is favored by double digits, and for good reason. I think when we South Carolina is like all of the SEC teams. There's NFL talent on South Carolina. Yeah. We got to fix that. We got to fix that. Chris Bell is a monster. South Carolina is again one of those teams that could beat anybody. I just don't see the consistency. We talked about Nick Harbor ad nauseum leading up to the season. Obviously rare size, speed, talent, but not a great football player in my mind. Right? He's had a few splash plays, but I just don't see him impacting the game on a consistent basis. Lenore Sellers, definitely in that conversation among these quarterbacks that you could take and develop and perhaps become a starter, the face of your franchise. But he's dealt with injury, inconsistency in play. I don't know what to make of this Ole Miss team. I'm not sure what to make of it. They're 7th in the country. They seemingly can beat just about anybody that they play in the SEC. So you're generally playing good competition. I just don't know that they have the staying power. Now, when you start talking about individual prospects, you tend to look to the defense. You tend to look on that side of the ball. I think Ole Miss had a better roster last season, but they may actually end up with a better record this year, interestingly enough. So I'll be watching this one just to kind of get a bead on an update on some of the prospects in this game, right? I think there's certainly going to be players on either side of the ball for each team that will be playing on Sunday. So I'll be tuning into that one for that purpose, right? You got Michigan holding serve against Purdue, and this one should be all Michigan, but it really comes down to Justice Haynes for me on the offensive side of the ball, right? Certainly Michigan has some quality draft prospects on the defensive side of the ball as well, but Justice Haynes as I'm trying to kind of figure out how this running back class is going to kind of sift out. He's helped himself a lot. He has helped himself a ton, right? Every time he touches a ball, he's liable to score. So I'm certain that NFL scouts have taken notice, and he's going to have an opportunity to continue to bolster his draft stock, right? Prime and Colorado, they've taken their lumps. They've certainly taken their lumps. We'll see if they can get their heads on straight against Arizona. Georgia Tech, NC State. Now, this is a really, really fascinating matchup here in the ACC, and I seem to be saying that a lot here about the ACC. Georgia Tech is for real as far as college football teams are concerned. So, their quarterback makes plays with his legs, makes timely throws. Their offensive line does a great job. They're well coached, very well coached. They're physical, and they have a pretty clear path to the ACC championship game, right? Georgia Tech is a tough out any way you slice it. This NC State team can beat Georgia Tech. Right? If they can stay ahead of schedule, they avoid turnovers, they can certainly beat Georgia Tech. If they can get off the field in some of those, down to go short yardage situations, because Tech, because of their offense and the fact that their quarterback is a primary ball carrier, anything like 4th and 3, 4th and 4, you gotta buckle your chin strap. Georgia Tech is coming downhill, right? They have that confidence. They have that level of execution. So CJ Bailey is a really talented prospect. He isn't quite a prospect yet. He's a true sophomore, but he can spin it. He can spin it. I wonder if NC State's defense can hold up enough in this game to pull an upset. It's at night. You're at home. You get the crowd behind you. You're able to create a turnover or two. This could be a trip up game for Georgia Tech, right? I expect Georgia Tech to win, but I wouldn't rule out an upset here, if NC State gets out to a fast start and perhaps steals a possession or two. So one to keep an eye on there. Oklahoma, Tennessee. Again, talking about quarterbacks, right? I think both of these teams have quality quarterbacks as far as, operating their offenses. John Mateer dealt with an injury. He's had some struggles, ups and downs. At one point we thought, okay, he's making his case, making his bid to be one of the top signal callers selected in the 2026 NFL draft. And then you kind of walk it back a little bit because of the inconsistencies. Deion Burks, of course, R. Mason Thomas, good football players on this Oklahoma team, as well as this Tennessee team. Joshua Joseph, I love him. I love him. I don't know that he has the upside as his predecessor. His name's escaping me, drafted by the Falcons. But I've been really impressed by him. I think Tennessee obviously have a pair of corners that are going to be drafted, one of which, perhaps the best corner in the country, has not played this year due to injury. But they got a decent quarterback in their own right. So among these late games, I see USC is going to be playing. So, you obviously want to tune in and watch Mekhi Lemon. Among these late games, Oklahoma and Tennessee certainly is where my focus will be. That one should come down to the wire, I would expect. Although Tennessee does have a nice home field advantage there in Knoxville. Cincinnati, Utah is also one you want to take a look at. Utah always feels a quality defense, lots of NFL talent over the years. Shout out to my colleague Mindy Spring. That one I'll check out after the Tennessee Oklahoma game wraps up. I'll probably tune in to Cincinnati, Utah. So that's your Week 10 slate. That's your Week 10 college football slate. I don't know that there's a ton of marquee matchups, but there's some intriguing ones this week. There's some intriguing ones in each hour slot, particularly the noon hour slot, and then of course the later games, I should say, around 7:30. I think that's the sweet spot here in Week 10. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the quarterbacks, the aforementioned quarterbacks this year, and I just mentioned, Tennessee, their quarterback play with Joey Aguilar. I know there's a bit of a Sawyer Robertson hive with Baylor. Ty Simpson certainly has helped himself since that initial game against Alabama. I mean, he's a 20-1 touchdown to INT ratio. He's completing just under 68% of his passes. So there's definitely some names that you need to kind of familiarize yourself with if you haven't or aren't already familiar with, because the landscape has changed, right? Entering the season, the focus was around Drew Aller. It was Cade Klubnik. It was Garrett Nussmeier. Those are three names. You could throw Lenore Sellers, and then again, as I mentioned, there was a hive for Fernando Mendoza. But I don't know. I shouldn't say I don't know. I certainly wasn't one of those individuals who was a Mendoza truther. I had not seen it. He had not proven it to me. But he's arguably the top prospect in the class now. Again, what I saw from Ty Simpson in years past, and then certainly, to open the season, I wasn't impressed, but he's just gotten better, gotten more comfortable. Kalen DeBoer seems to have kind of righted the ship there in Alabama. So he certainly is making a case for it, right? Mississippi, you mentioned it earlier in terms of some of the teams that are quarterback needy. You got the Miami Dolphins, whom just parted ways with their GM Chris Greer. So that seems to be like the first domino to fall. Now, will it be Mike McDaniel to follow? Is Tua on the block? I would imagine. That's how that's going to go. And that is the kind of the trinity, right? You can obviously add ownership in there, but quarterback, head coach, GM is really the trinity, right? Assuming you don't have a meddling owner, and it's in flux with the Dolphins. It's in flux with the Dolphins, and the Dolphins don't seemingly have like that path to the next guy. There's no player currently on the roster that you could say, okay, we if we move off of Tua, here's who we want to get a good look at, right? I don't think Quinn Ewers is that player, right? So it kind of depends, because again, I think entering this season, we expected a healthy number of quarterbacks to go in those first 50 or so selections, right? We were thinking maybe upwards of 4, perhaps even 5 quarterbacks in the first round. You know what I'm saying? And considering the hype and how those players kind of finished last year, and I just don't see it that way. I just don't see it that way at this point. I think you probably have 2 players among the quarterback position in college football right now who would likely go in the first round. I think you could probably push that number closer to 3 if you add Lenore Sellers into the mix, right? Because there's a lot of talent there, albeit a lack of consistency. I wouldn't say that he has hurt himself the way that a Cade Klubnik has, or in the case of Drew Aller, he's just hurt, right? So I think, like I said, the landscape has really changed in terms of what we anticipated, what we expected going into this season versus what has actually played out. So if you're the Miami Dolphins, what do you do here? Do you perhaps opt for a quarterback, a guy that you think could develop into a starter, that you want to groom to be a starter on day 2? Because the Dolphins have a lot of issues. It certainly there's a question mark about the quarterback position. Of course, you paid Tua of the big money. He's struggled to stay healthy. There's been some inconsistencies, obviously. When things look good, when things are clean, and Tua's playing on time and rhythm, it's really impressive watching Miami's offense. But they just, when things are off schedule, which is the nature of the beast, right? You got to be able to make plays when things are off schedule. He's a below average quarterback under those circumstances. So I just wonder, depending on where Miami ends up, you bring in a new coach, a new GM. I would imagine they want their own guy. They would want to kind of reset things, right? The contract situation, that's a question mark. I don't have all the details readily available or aware of them at this point. It's something that I'll have to explore a little bit more. But what are we looking at in terms of dead cap, right? Is there a market for Tua, right? Would a team be willing to take on some of that salary cap? I don't know that there would be. I don't know that there would be, given Tua's concussion history and and the fact that there's some limitations. There's some limitations there. So Miami certainly is in the market. It just kind of depends on whether or not they want to reset, with a quarterback in the first round, or perhaps roll with Tua another year and kind of bring in who they think will be his ultimate replacement and groom that quarterback behind him. Mr. C. Price, you mentioned or asked a question regarding who would trade for Air Raid from the Colts. Man, I don't know what his stock looks like right now, right? It's not. I don't want to bag on Daniel Jones. I don't, because Daniel Jones is playing some real good football. Playing real good football. I know his confidence, was effectively destroyed, right? Um, some of that was, the situation, pass protection, dearth of weapons, coaching, but Daniel Jones didn't always help himself either. He's found new life in Indianapolis, right? And to think, just a year ago, how Daniel Jones was thought of and the way he was perceived versus now, and the fact that the Colts basically said, look, you know, hey, Richie, you're not our guy. Effectively, I don't know how much of a market Anthony Richardson would have, right? And again, here's the part. I think this goes back to his time at UF, right? Anthony Richardson, he declared too early. There was a lot of development that needed to take place with Anthony Richardson, right? You could see obviously big time physical tools and ability, but in terms of playing the quarterback position, he had not had enough starts under his belt, and I don't know that the development was great at UF either, right? So you then come into the NFL, and the Colts don't have a quarterback in place that's going to be able to start for the balance of the year, right? There's going to be people and within the organization, fans, whatever, clamoring for Anthony Richardson. You play him before he's actually ready, but also he needs the reps because he has had so few starts at the collegiate level. So Anthony Richardson, as I've always maintained, is that he was overdrafted, right? He was overdrafted. It certainly did not coalesce there in Indianapolis. But to your point, Mr. Ciprassi, I'm not sure he has much of a trade market at this point. I don't know that we've seen enough flashes. It depends. It depends. If the Colts are willing to take a late day 3 pick for him, well, then yeah, I imagine somebody will take him on. But I can't imagine it will be to compete as a starter. It'll be like, okay, we see the tools, we see the skill set, we have an established veteran, or we have a bridge in place. You know what? Let's see if we can catch lightning in a bottle. Maybe under those circumstances. So but yeah, Anthony Richardson to me, wasn't ready to actually, even because there's a development arc that takes place at the NFL level. He wasn't ready for that. He still needed more seasoning at the collegiate level, as far as I'm concerned, right? Before you could even think about, okay, NFL curve, So, but to your point, that there likely will be someone intrigued enough by his skill set, assuming the price is right. You mentioned Minnesota should take him, or is that you may be referring to Fields? I feel like Fields can get a shot somewhere. Richardson can too. I think in the case of Fields, Fields has done more, right? You could argue that he's gotten more opportunity, but Fields has made himself available. And I will say this about Justin Fields, and this is coming from someone who's been a big believer, supporter of Justin Fields, right? Justin Fields is a backup quarterback at the NFL level. He doesn't process fast enough, doesn't have the pocket presence, in order to avoid negative plays on a consistent basis. He's a backup quarterback. He's a great athlete. I think in certain instances you really get excited about what he's capable of doing, but there's just no consistency. And we've seen enough of him to at least in my mind, to be able to say, okay, all right, we know what Justin Fields is. And I'm sure there are people who felt like that since day one, and then, in more recent years. But I was a staunch believer. I think part of the issue with Justin Fields is the development arc, right? I don't think he was ever in a great position in Chicago, right? And he certainly isn't in a good one here in New York. All right. Now, you've been in the league for several years, so you don't necessarily get that excuse. At some point, that excuse is it no longer applies. But he played for a lot of first time coaches, defensive head coaches. He didn't necessarily have great offensive coordinators or folks around him with a proven track record of developing quarterbacks. And then, of course, here with the Jets, mind you, I'm pulling for Aaron Glenn, but we got a first time play caller, right? You know what I'm saying? It's all of the things. It's all of the things. I think there's been a significant lack of development at the professional level with Justin Fields, and Justin Fields has not corrected his issues in terms of processing, understanding what the defense is doing to him, and being able to cycle through and get through those reads with enough haste. And then, of course, his feel for pressure. You know, you'd hope a guy who is that athletic, that kind of linear speed could sense when to pull the ball down and go. And often he doesn't. Often he doesn't. So yes, I think your point is well taken here, Mr. C. If Justin Fields can get another shot, certainly Anthony Richardson can. I just think Justin Fields has more better film than Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson has struggled to put film together, NFL film together, right? So again, it comes down to who's going to give him an opportunity. Who ultimately is going to give him an opportunity? We've talked about the Dolphins. Let's stay with the Jets. Let's stay with the Jets here, right? I don't think Justin Fields is the answer. I don't think he's the answer. I also think that the Jets need to make some changes in terms of the coaching staff. So this is the first go around from Aaron Glenn. Got to bring in a more accomplished play caller. I think a guy who's had some legitimate history, evidence of developing the quarterback, because I think they need to go quarterback. Again, this is the team that has other issues. They certainly have a lack of perimeter threats. They're going to need to rebuild on the defensive side of the ball. That used to be a strength, and that doesn't seem to be a strength anymore. But they need a signal caller. They need a signal caller. And again, I mentioned Mendoza. Don't hire that guy, Mr. C. You can't. You're absolutely right about that. Do not hire that guy. As I mentioned, Fields isn't the answer, but are you uniquely prepared to turn the keys over to a rookie, right? Week one, I think Fields is on a cap friendly enough contract to keep him. In the event you don't necessarily feel like the quarterback is ready to go out the gate, right? Because I think the last thing you want to do, especially a team that's looking for their long-term starter, is to have nothing, right? They may want to figure out what they have out of Kyle McCord. They may decide that that's the direction they want to go is at some point this year, because it's the Jets aren't competing for a playoff spot. At some point this year, you let Kyle McCord play and you get a sense of what he can do, what he may be, you know what I mean? And then from there you decide, okay, going through that evaluation process, you get a training camp. Do I have a guy that's ready to go? I would not summarily dismiss Justin Fields in terms of my quarterback room. I think he certainly should be on an NFL roster. I just think he's a QB too. I think Fields is the type of guy that could win you a few games, right? You're seeing it throughout the league where, you need a decent backup, right? If you if you're in a situation where you can't manage to survive a month with your backup, then you probably won't be able to sustain success. There's a lot of luck. A lot of things need to break the right way in order for teams to have success year in and year out. But in this day and age, I think you might need a quarterback, a QB2 who can pinch hit for you at times, right? You got games over the seas, you got Thursday night games, you got you know what I'm saying? You got double headers on Monday night. So your body isn't always recovering the way it should be. Obviously they added the 17th game. You need a pinch hitter. You need a QB2. at times. And I think Fields is a good quarterback too. So from a Jets perspective, wouldn't jettison him, but you do need to figure out the quarterback position long term. What you got here, Mr. C? Or maybe to trade it and use on a yeah, yeah. I think there's a certain level of that across the board as far as not it doesn't feel like and maybe things change, right? Like I said, Ty Simpson and Fernando Mendoza are playing some impressive ball. They're playing impressive ball right now. Mendoza leads the country in TDs with 24, 3 INTs. As I mentioned, Ty Simpson 20 and 1, right? So they're playing highly efficient, putting up good numbers. But do you get the sense? Do you get the sense that these guys are top of the draft picks, right? Where does Mendoza and Ty Simpson kind of juxtapose against a Cam Ward, for example, right? Because when I watch Cam Ward, I see a guy, and of course Tennessee is just there's a lot of work to be done around Cam Ward, right? Very bad situation. Do you feel like either of these players could come in and right the ship? It's going to be a tall order. Whoever's picking first, unless it's a trade up type of situation, it's going to be a tall order. Those teams are bad. They're bad for a reason. You know what I mean? So, yeah, it may make more sense to go get you a Ruben Bain, right? If you feel like you're a Ruben Bain away from really competing, you could get aggressive and move up. You know what I'm saying? But quarterbacks tend to be pushed up the board, or we could have a scenario which I don't think that's going to be the case this time. But a few years back, the year that you had Kenny Pickett and Desmond Ritter and Malik Willis, you just had the one quarterback selected in the first round, and many felt like that was a reach. Kenny Pickett went, I believe, 20th overall to Pittsburgh. You know, so that's a I gotta I can't answer that in the affirmative. I can't. I would need to really dig into his all 22, but that's a good question, Mrs. C. And perhaps I'll turn my attention there after I wrap up this Mendoza breakdown. Um, DeBoer generally is a quarterback friendly system, right? But the reality is that the quarterback play as a whole has been so disappointing among the guys that we kind of had pegged to be going earlier. It's time to kind of recalibrate our thoughts. It's kind of recalibrate, and I also think one of the things that isn't necessarily part of the equation just yet is scheme, right? Like what's the situation that we think these quarterbacks would be most successful in, right? Because I think all of that plays a role. Obviously supporting cast, and we talk about supporting cast. I'm not just talking about the weapons. I'm talking about the offensive line as well, right? Do you have a complementary run game? All of that plays a role. I don't. I still don't feel like any quarterback is the type of player that I think is a culture changer. I could be wrong about that. I've been wrong about quarterbacks before. I don't get the sense. I feel like Cam Ward was a culture changer, right? I think if Tennessee is able to get the right coach in place, eventually Tennessee is going to be a tough out with Cam Ward leading the charge. They have some roster upheaval things to address, but Cam Ward seems to me like the type to move that needle. While Mendoza is playing incredibly well and Ty Simpson is playing incredibly well, Dante Moore kind of strikes me more as the type of guy who can kind of change the culture. Now, I don't think he's ready. I wouldn't suggest coming out just yet, but the poise that he plays with, I think kind of suggests that type of thing. And again, maybe a bit premature on that with respect to Dante Moore, and maybe I'm not giving Mendoza or Simpson enough credit on that end. But I just don't see a player that I regard in the same way as a Cam Ward, right? I just don't. So what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of where these quarterbacks get drafted? At the end of the day, I think it's going to come down to who's who's at the top of the board. I don't know that the Jets can afford to trade down. Maybe they can, perhaps they can, but I don't know that they can afford to trade down. right? They may consider, let's say, Simpson and Mendoza more of a back half of the first round. Are you going to risk it? Are you going to risk it? Right? Maybe if you're able to get an additional first round pick or what have you, um, maybe under those circumstances. But it's really difficult to say at this point. I think we need some more time to elapse, more film. Obviously, get into this pre-draft process to see how that may kind of come into focus. But um, as I said, the quarterback position is it's taking shape a bit more, but I still think it's a fluid situation. Once you get past the Mendozas and the Simpsons of the world, you got the likes of a Taylor Green. You got some interesting, intriguing names, but I don't know that anybody's just kind of taking the bulls by the horn outside of Mendoza and more recently here Ty Simpson, right? And it seems to me that it's kind of like pick your flavor. Mendoza has the big arm, but obviously very sharp in the short to intermediate areas of the field, where Simpson, seemingly has the edges as far as processing is concerned, which is obviously a big part of playing the quarterback position at a high level in the NFL. So um, I wanted to talk about the quarterback position because I'm intrigued by it because there's just so many question marks around it, right? There was no doubt in my mind that Cam was the man last year. And I think, by and large, most felt that way. This year, a lot more volatility, a lot more uncertainty around the quarterback position, which makes it very intriguing. Yeah, yeah, he continues to take the steps in the right place. Damar Williams is certainly that skill set. Certainly, that skill set is coveted. And maybe not as early as 2026, but you got to look at like situations, and I'm going to get back to the NFL teams here, but like situations like Kyler Murray. You think Kyler Murray's the guy? Do you think Kyler Murray is the guy that's going to get Arizona to the next plateau? I'm not so sure about that. Not so sure about that, right? Um, you mentioned New Orleans, the Saints. They've made a decision at quarterback. Tyler Shuck is going to start for the balance of the year. I think it makes sense considering that you use a second round pick on him. I disagree with that move. Shuck has a live arm. He has a live arm. So does Spencer Rattler. So it's going to come down to, does he get better from week to week? You know what I'm saying? Clearly, Kellen Moore thought highly enough of him to take him in the second round. He's had an opportunity to kind of sit and observe, played a bit last week. We'll see what he does with this opportunity. I think there are some talented players around him. Headley was talking about that Saints roster and saying, it's better than we're giving it credit for. I'll say this: I think there are worse situations. Let me put it that way, as far as supporting cast for a young quarterback. I think there are certainly worse situations, i.e., Tennessee. So we'll see what Tyler Shuck does with his opportunity, but that's another team that could very well be in the market for a signal caller. And again, once you get past Mendoza and Ty Simpson, who's gonna take the bull by the horns? Who are you gonna roll the dice on? Who's going to be your Jalen Hurts? A second round pick. You had Carson Wentz. You know what I'm saying? And lo and behold, Jalen Hurts is Super Bowl MVP. You know what I mean? Two-time, NFC champion. You know what I'm saying? So, it's just one of those things where, there may be a player that isn't taken necessarily in the first round that happens to blossom and finds himself in a quality situation and takes advantage of his opportunity. The other team I wanted to mention was the Raiders. The Las Vegas Raiders. When we were doing our mock drafts, whether it be all 32 teams or Raider specific, the thought process was we got to find a quarterback. We got to find a quarterback, even if it's not a guy first round, right? Even if we're not expecting him to start year one, year two. We need to figure out kind of long term what our plan is at the quarterback position. And they did draft the quarterback, but I'm not sure if he's the guy. The Geno Smith experiment has not been very good to this point. Geno has not played well. It's not played well. That said, I know they've had some issues along their offensive line. Ashton Jeanty hasn't quite got on track. Brock Bowers has been hurt. So certainly it hasn't been an ideal situation. But Geno, with his experience, you'd expect him to play a little bit better, right? You'd expect him to make some better decisions, and that hasn't necessarily been the case. So I'm interested. I'm really interested to kind of see ultimately how it plays out with respect to the Las Vegas Raiders, because you do have Gino under contract. You decided to give him that contract, so it would be a situation, I would imagine, where you're bringing in a guy as an understudy, and that may be the best case scenario with respect to this draft class, right? Again, I'm not sure if there's anybody that I feel like, okay, I'm just going with him. Good, bad, ugly, we'll take our lumps. I'm just going with him. I think you do need to give yourself an opportunity to build this team up a little bit more, get another off season to enhance the roster, let that young quarterback learn how to prepare, get steeped in your playbook, and then maybe towards the end of the season, or perhaps even in the 2027 season, become the starter. But definitely need to be thinking about what that succession plan is going to look like at the quarterback position in Vegas. And then a couple other areas, a couple other teams that come to mind as it relates to the quarterback position. Again, talking about it from a starter's perspective, as well as having a quality backup, right? I think we could have that conversation about most NFL teams, about having a competent backup and the need for that. But I look at a team like San Francisco as well, right? Mac Jones could be, positioning himself to get another opportunity to be someone's QB1, right? I know that Kyle Shanahan had always been a fan of his. With the incumbent having his injuries, Mac Jones has done a good job. He's done a pretty good job. He hasn't been perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he's done a good job. So, what kind of how does that play out, right? Because I would imagine Mac Jones is going to be looking for an opportunity to start next year, right? And there may be some, certainly, teams looking for a veteran. Aaron Rodgers is an older quarterback at Pittsburgh, playing decently, but certainly an older quarterback. I don't know how much more football he plans on playing. Matthew Stafford could be thinking, about life after football as well. So there are a few situations where, there's a guy there now, but what's 2026 going to look like, right? And when you talk about this class, or this prospective 2026 NFL draft class, where does Mac Jones kind of slot, in that conversation? Would you rather invest in another position and opt for Mac Jones, considering the way he's playing for Kyle Shanahan? And of course, there's lots of, you know, branches, right? In terms of coaching trees, when you talk about Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan, there's a lot of branches throughout the NFL, and getting him in the right offense may be, a big part of how he's able to have success outside of San Francisco. So, another interesting kind of team because of the impact it could have on the 2026 NFL draft quarterback class. Who else? Think about it for a second here. What we got here? Mac Jones in Miami in 2026 makes sense. It makes sense. Like you hit the nail on the head, right? As far as system is concerned, Mike McDaniel, he worked for the Shanahan. He understands that. Wide zone, play action. You know what I'm saying? That might be a good fit. Now, again, how does that impact? How does Tua all kind of correlate into that? It may make more sense to go young quarterback because of expenditures. Mac Jones is going to want a healthy contract, I would imagine. I still don't know why the Raiders did not take Shador. That we're gonna probably be talking about that a lot here soon, because Shador is about to get his opportunity. Dylan Gabriel, has not played well. That comes as little surprise. Shador's gonna get his opportunity, and Hadley and Drew were like, "Listen, man." Despite the fact that the Browns have 2 first-round picks, they're not drafting a quarterback next year. I said, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. It was like, no, Shador is the guy. And I certainly hope it works out that way. It's obvious. It's obvious the head coach is not a fan of Shador Sanders. It's painfully obvious. And I just don't know a lot of quarterbacks who have had success in situations like that, right? Like, despite the coach, having it out for them effectively, being able to go out and have success. Now Cleveland has some intriguing pieces. They certainly need to improve their offensive line. They have a excellent defense, but I hope Shador tears it up. I really do, because I thought Shador entering the 2025 NFL draft was the second best quarterback prospect. You could make an argument for Dart. I wouldn't be upset if you go with Dart over Shador, and Dart has certainly flashed. He's playing with a lot of confidence. But yeah, going to back to your point, Mrs. C, I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know what they were thinking. Um, even if you didn't go Shador, right? Jalen Milrow, like it just seemed to me like especially with the picks that they had in on day 2 and day 3, that they certainly could have added that prospect who could serve as an understudy to Geno and develop, because again, you don't know what you're getting with Geno, right? You might get catch lightning in a bottle, or you might get the Jets version of Geno. You just don't know what you're getting. You understand what I'm saying? So to me, it made a lot of sense to prioritize a developmental prospect in your mind, right? And I think there was I think if Antonio Pierce was there, I think certainly Shador would have been in Las Vegas. Missed opportunity. I also thought, to your point, that the relationship that Brady has with the Sanders family, with Shador specifically, it would have been a great fit. You know, yeah, exactly. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the majority owner overruled them. There seemed to be, and we don't have to rehash that, but there seemed to be a calculated, issue there as it relates to Shador. I think all the organizations were very much, we're not touching them. So unfortunate, but Shador should get his opportunity here, and hopefully he takes full advantage of it. Yeah, yeah. The Raiders made the most sense to me. I agree. Definitely, I agree. All right. Who else comes to mind, Mrs. C, as far as teams with interesting, intriguing quarterback situations, maybe in the market for a quarterback in the 2026 NFL draft? Just kind of thinking through the divisions. Cincinnati definitely needs a backup, unless Flacco is going to continue to play. They just struggle to protect Joe Burrow, and Burrow stay healthy. Um, AFC South, I think, is in pretty good shape, albeit I think they're comfortable with Trevor Lawrence, but I know there's some question marks around him as well. They paid him, though. There's some question marks there. Dallas, Mississippi, yes, they should be thinking in terms of developmental quarterback guy, but I will say this: I think Dak has been playing at aside from most recently, I think against Denver, Dak has been playing at a high level. Dak came in great shape this year, and despite all of the other issues with the roster, Micah Parsons and so on and so forth, Dak has been playing at a pretty high level. Yes, certainly. Although I think they like Joe Milton. They traded for Joe Milton. He actually got some run once that game got out of hand. That's the question mark. The salary cap as it relates to Dak, right? The Joneses have not handled their salary cap situation particularly well. That's what led to the Michael Parsons trade. They do have 2 first-round picks. I imagine there would be quite a few teams that would be in the market for Dak Prescott. And it may be a good thing. It may be a good thing for Dak to get out of Dallas, But I just the likelihood seems low on this. The likelihood seems really low considering the way Dak has been playing. Yeah, that's I know Lawrence has got a little bit longer in the tooth, maybe not quite as effective, but it came down to dollars and cents. I'm sure it came down to dollars and cents. Yeah. So You think about that NFC East team, I think you're in pretty good shape among the quarterbacks. You go to the North. I need Caleb Williams to play better, man. I need him to play better. I'm not suggesting that the Bears need to go and think about Plan B, but um, and it is what is it? 8 games in a new offensive system. I had hoped that he would be a little further along. I think just some of the issues that I see from Caleb Williams, I'm not seeing him correct it from one week to the next. That's my frustration with Caleb Williams, right? It's not that he makes a mistake or does something silly, trying to do too much or whatever the case may be. It's that he repeats those things. He's not actually correcting them from week to week, which you know I imagine will wear thin on Ben Johnson if he doesn't get that situated. But he certainly needs to play better. Minnesota, I don't know. I don't know what to make of JJ McCarthy, right? Because he's dealt with injury. We haven't seen him. Carson Wentz certainly has dealt with injury. He's now, effectively torn labrum and just messed up his shoulder, his non-throwing shoulder, whatever the case may be. So I think JJ McCarthy is ready to come back, perhaps, maybe. Um, when he was selected, I understood the allure of McCarthy. There's certainly things to like about him. Obviously, the success he had at Michigan. I had him closer to where Bo Nix was drafted. I had him much closer to where Bo Nix was drafted. Now, I think Bo Nix has played certainly better than I had anticipated, but I'm still not ready to crown him. I still see those certain areas of his game that make me shake my head at times. But he seemingly has figured out how not to let it snowball when he's struggling in the game, right? And I think that's important. I think it's important for NFL quarterbacks, any quarterback for that matter, to when things aren't going well, I'm not playing particularly well. I don't let it carry through the entire duration of the contest, right? I figure it out at some point. So that's good. That is a feather in Nooks' cap. But I had McCarthy as far as how I stack the quarterbacks up closer to Bo Nix, which I was a bit lower on than Williams, Daniels, May, and Penix. And again, we just haven't seen much of JJ McCarthy to this point, right? So the book is still out there. You go to the West. I think the Seahawks did it right. I think the Seahawks, Mr. C, have certainly done it right. It's you bring in Sam Darnold, who is obviously executing this offense at a high level. JSN going crazy. But then you brought in Milroe. You brought in Jalen Milroe, who again I thought probably should have gone back to school. I think him having another year in DeBoer's offense would have been good for him. But the expectation was never for him to play, right? It was never for him to play and this year and perhaps not even next year, especially the way Darnold's playing. And Darnold, albeit has been in the league for eons, is still a young player. I think he's still in his late 20s at this point. So the Seahawks, I don't know that they have a Hall of Fame quarterback, taking snaps. I think their quarterback room is in a good place. The Rams I mentioned definitely need to be thinking about what life after Matthew Stafford looks like, right? Does that come in the form of a veteran that may have bounced around, i.e., a Mac Jones? But again, I think Mac Jones is going to come at a decent price tag, right? And armed with 2 first-round picks, it makes sense. Now, the question then becomes, who's the guy, right? Are you going to have an early enough pick to get a Ty Simpson or a Fernando Mendoza? Do you feel comfortable about perhaps rolling the dice on one of those toolsy prospects like a Norris Sellers, given that he might have an opportunity to develop behind Matthew Stafford? Again, how much longer do we expect Stafford to play? That I think that's a big part of the question. But either way, given Stafford's injury history, certainly need to figure out the long-term plan at quarterback. Start that process for sure. That's the West. I mentioned Arizona earlier too. I don't think Cutler's it, bro. I don't think Kyler's the guy. I simply don't think he's the guy. I don't think he is the leader that's necessary in order to get a team like the Cardinals, who've had a history of underachieving. I'll put it lightly, underachieving over the hump. I just don't think he's that guy. I don't think he wants it enough, right? And I think despite his arm talent and his ability to extend plays and make plays with his legs, I think his size presents a challenge. I think it limits what you can do offensively, right? In terms of the play action game, playing with your back to the defense, and um, your offensive line, right? The interior offensive line needs to be among the best in order to support a player like Murray, week in and week out. And I don't know that they're just, uniquely set up in order to do so. So that's another team. That's another team that I think needs to think about the quarterback position long term. Again, they paid him, but it's almost out of necessity at certain times. It's the timing associated when these quarterbacks are going to be up for their contract extensions. You try to get out in front of it, although it's a lot of money. If you wait, it becomes too much money. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah. I think I'm out on Kyler Murray. I hate to say that, and I could be wrong. I could be premature there, but I think I might be out on Kyler Murray. I think that's the NFC. If I go to the AFC West, we talked about the Raiders. Chargers are fine. KC obviously is fine. Denver has their guy. AFC North, Pittsburgh. I mentioned Pittsburgh. Do they think Will Howard is the guy? Right? They drafted him, I believe, in the 6th round, the 2025 NFL draft. Gets an opportunity to sit behind Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers is the oldest quarterback in the NFL. So can't be certain that Rodgers will play beyond this season. Does Will Howard demonstrate enough, through the various practices and then another off season, whatever the case may be the guy, or do you bring somebody in to compete with him? And then how soon do you do that? How early do you do that? Right? I think the fact that Howard lasted as long as he did, I would be surprised. I would be surprised if they did not, address that position in the 2026 NFL draft. Um, if you have Rodgers, it gives you a little bit more flexibility. But if not, the Steelers might be one of those teams that feels the need to move up and get their guy. All right. Cleveland again. Shador. The question mark is Shador. Such a terrible situation as far as I'm concerned. Cleveland has had their issues as far as identifying quarterback. It's been a lengthy challenge for them, but to have again a head coach who seemingly wants nothing to do with the best option you have at quarterback. And oh, by the way, Deshaun Watson is going to be activated soon, or at least he'll be in that window to be activated. So I don't know what the plan is. They had Kenny Pickett, they traded him away. They had Flacco, they traded him away. They go to Dylan Gabriel. Again, things play out kind of as we expected. Um, despite all the decisions that have been made to kind of lament then starting Shador, I just don't know if it's a situation that's conducive to success. And then we're talking about a new head coach in all likelihood, right? I mean, Myles Garrett had what, 5 sacks last week? Team lost. Like that's tough. That's tough, man. Um, you talk about a new head coach. Are they going to want to hitch their wagon to Shador? Assuming Shador plays well. Let's just make the assumption he plays well. They're going to want to hitch their wagon to that. Does Shador do enough to force a new coach's hand? Probably is going to want his own guy, especially when armed with a couple of first-round picks. Now, you may look at this goes back to the 2026 NFL draft class. You may look at the class up and down. You look at the totality of it. It's like, I don't know that there's anybody here that is markedly better than Shador Sanders in my mind. Okay, different type of situation. But That may not be the case. New head coach might have the same type of, you know, whether it be a byproduct of the collusion and what college coaches and NFL execs are saying, whatever the case may be, they may have their own issues with Shador Sanders, right? So, yeah, that one, that's not a pretty situation. Again, best case scenario, Shador plays out of his mind, and he's the guy. That's the best case scenario in my mind. I just don't know that it's going to happen. I'm not convinced that it will happen that way. All right. Mississippi Nebraska with a stamp is going with Damon Williams over Arch Manning. Listen, Arch has done nothing to this point to suggest otherwise, right? The cachet that Arch came into this season with, I think he's blown right through it. He that goodwill that he ultimately came in with, I think all of that has evaporated because Texas has underachieved. No doubt about it. Okay, I mentioned the Browns. If I go to the AFC East, we talked the Finns, we've talked the Jets. I think we've covered all our bases, Mr. C. I think we have covered all our bases as far as what this 2026 NFL draft class will look like among the quarterback position. The variance between what we kind of expected going into this college football season versus where we're at now. And then, of course, what it looks like as far as NFL teams, the NFL landscape. I think for sure this class has some really intriguing prospects as it relates to developmental prospects, QB2s. I like, go get you one. Go get you one. Now, if you're a team in need of a starter, that's where it gets a little hairy. I think, like I said, right now it's a short list of names that I would roll the dice on, but I don't feel great about it. I don't feel fantastic about it right now. Now that may change. Mendoza continues to do what he's doing. That could change. As I jump into this Ty Simpson tape, that certainly is subject to change. But again, right now I don't feel like you got a Cam Ward in this class. So there you have it. There you have it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this live stream, even on a solo tip. What say you, Mrs. C? Like I said, Mrs. C, I'm glad you mentioned. Listen, hey man, they have done nothing to help themselves. Les Miles, Brian Kelly fired. Hey man, it's been rough. It's been rough for the guys that we thought were going to actually be part of this conversation, right? And that isn't to say that we were sold on them. We just thought that they would be part of the conversation. They're not even part of the conversation anymore. It's Haller, Nussmeier, Club. They're not even a factor at this point. So things certainly have been kind of put on their ear here. But yeah, Mr. C, I will work on getting that mock draft simulator update. In fact, I think I have a line on getting the trade functionality associated with it. So hopefully we can get that done here before we get to the heart of draft season. So that's going to do it. That's going to do it for this edition of the Second Half Draft Show. Be sure to like and subscribe, and certainly check us out on Couch Potato General Manager. I got the Mendoza draft, or not draft breakdown, but film study that again I've been working on for weeks. Just kind of a little here, there, a little there. I'm almost done with it, so be on the lookout for that. All right. Happy Halloween. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week.